I need to tell you about a root that breaks every rule they taught us in school. One plant, 8 people fed for 3 months straight. Not rationed, not starving, fed. My great-grandpa used to say his grandmother could pull enough from one patch to keep the family through winter when the wheat failed. I didn't believe him until I saw the numbers myself. This isn't some ancient mystery crop from a lost civilization. This grew in America, in Europe, in backyards and field edges, and along every farm fence from here to the Atlantic. People planted it once and ate from it for decades. It came back stronger every year without seed, without replanting, without begging it to grow. Then we erased it. Not slowly, not by accident. In one generation, maybe 2, we took a plant that fed millions through wars and famines and depressions and turned it into something most folks can't even name. You won't find it in supermarkets. It's not in the USDA guidelines. Most farmers under 60 have never grown it commercially. But here's what gets me. It didn't fail. It didn't stop producing. It didn't get a disease or lose its vigor. We removed it because it succeeded too well at the one thing that terrifies the system. It fed people without asking permission. My grandpa told me stories his father told him about the old days, before everything came in bags with brand names. He said there were plants back then that didn't need you to buy new seed every spring, didn't need the fertilizer truck, didn't need the chemical man coming around. You planted them once when you were young, and your grandchildren harvested them when you were dead. This root was the king of that world. 1 tuber in the ground became 10 pounds by fall. Those 10 pounds became 100 the next year if you left some in the soil. It laughed at frost, ignored drought better than almost anything else, stored itself underground through winters that killed everything else in the garden. The math still stuns me when I work it out. One plant properly established, producing 15 to 20 pounds of edible tubers. A person needs about half a pound a day to get real calories, the kind that stick to your ribs. That's 40 days of food from one plant, and that plant makes 10 more while you're eating. 8 people for 3 months from one plant's descendants. That's not marketing language. That's not exaggeration. That's the actual arithmetic when you let it do what it does naturally. But you've probably never eaten it. Your parents probably haven't either. Maybe your grandparents remember, if they're old enough, if they grew up rural enough, if they came from the kind of people who kept the old knowledge alive. We're going to talk about why that happened. Not the story they tell in agriculture textbooks, not the clean narrative about progress and efficiency. The real reason, the one that involves money and control and a very deliberate choice about what kind of food system we were going to build. Because this plant didn't vanish. It's still here, growing in ditches and forgotten fence lines and the edges of old homesteads, waiting. And some folks are starting to remember what it can do. My great-grandpa's people had a name for it. So did the French. So did the Germans and Russians, who survived on it when everything else was gone. It's time we learn that name again. The name is a lie. That's the first thing you need to know. Jerusalem artichoke. It's not from Jerusalem. It's not an artichoke. The name itself is erasure, covering up what it really was and who really grew it. My great-grandpa's people, the ones who were here before the Europeans, they called it something else. The Algonquin word was sunroot in their language. Other tribes had other names, but they all meant the same thing. The root that comes from the tall flower that follows the sun, because that's what it is, a sunflower. A giant perennial sunflower that puts its energy underground instead of into seeds. They'd been growing it for over 1,000 years before a single European set foot here. Not wild harvesting, growing it, cultivating it in plots near their villages, managing it, selecting the best tubers to leave in the ground. This wasn't some accident of nature they stumbled on. This was agriculture. The old folks passed down stories about how it saved communities during bad hunting seasons, how you could always count on the sunroot. when everything else failed, how it marked the places where people had lived, because it came back year after year, even after the villages moved on. When the French explorers first encountered it, they tried to describe the taste. Someone said it reminded them of an artichoke heart. The word Jerusalem probably came from girasole, the Italian word for sunflower, so we got Jerusalem artichoke, a name that erases every connection to this continent and the people who developed it. By the time my great-great-grandparents were young, white settlers had taken the plant and forgotten where it came from. They just knew it grew like crazy and fed them through hard times. The origin story got lost. Convenient that, take the crop, lose the credit, it spread across Europe faster than almost any other American plant. By the 1600s, it was growing in France, England, Germany. By the 1700s, it was in Russia. Everywhere it went, it did the same thing, produced massive amounts of food with almost no effort. And everywhere it went, people forgot it came from the indigenous farmers of North America. I remember my grandmother showing me a patch of them growing wild behind the old barn. She said her mother planted them during the Depression, and they never stopped coming back, tall as a man by midsummer, bright yellow flowers in the fall, and underground, those knobby tubers that looked like ginger root had a baby with a potato. She called them sunchokes, which is what some folks are trying to rebrand them as now, trying to get away from that fake Jerusalem name. But even sunchoke is marketing language invented in the 1960s by somebody who thought it sounded friendlier. The real name is lost. The Algonquin languages that had the original word are mostly gone now, beaten out of people in boarding schools and missionary camps. We have the plant, but not the proper name for it. We have the food, but not the full story of who made it what it is. That's how erasure works. You don't have to burn every book. You just have to change the labels. Rename things until nobody remembers where they came from. Then you can pretend your system invented everything worth having. But the plant remembers. It grows the same way it did 1,000 years ago. The tubers form in the same patterns. The flowers turn toward the sun just like they did when the people who really understood them were still free to farm their own land. Samuel de Champlain wrote it down. That matters. We have the date, the place, the exact words, July 1605, Cape Cod. He was mapping the coastline for France when he found the native villages, and he wrote about what he saw growing there. He called them roots which they cultivate, and said they tasted like artichokes. He watched the Wampanoag people harvest them, watched how they stored them, watched how much food came out of those gardens. He wasn't some vague explorer telling tall tales. He was a navigator who recorded everything, and he recorded abundance. My great-grandpa used to say the old people told stories about when the French first came through, how they were starving on their ships, eating salt pork and hardtack, sick with scurvy, how the native people fed them, not just once but over and over. The sunroot was part of that. It kept through winter when other vegetables rotted. It was there when the Europeans needed it. By 1629, colonists in Massachusetts were growing it themselves. John Winthrop, Jr. mentioned it in his letters. By 1636, it was common enough in colonial gardens that people stopped remarking on it. It had become ordinary. That's how good it was. It went from exotic to everyday in one generation because it simply worked. The French took it home. Marc Lescarbot, another early explorer, brought tubers back to France in 1607. Within 20 years, it was growing in Paris markets. Within 50 years, it was all over Europe. You can track its spread through cooking manuscripts and garden journals. Italy by 1617, England by 1621, Germany by 1632. But here's what those records show that nobody talks about. It wasn't spreading because kings commanded it or because some agricultural department promoted it. It spread because regular people planted it once and then told their neighbors about it. Because it solved problems. Because when you're a peasant farmer trying to feed your family through a hard winter, and someone shows you a plant that produces food without replanting, you pay attention. There's a French agricultural survey from 1709 that lists it as one of the most important crops for common people, not for the nobility, for the folks who couldn't afford to fail. It calls it a resource against famine. Those are the exact words, a resource against famine. My grandpa's father remembered old-timers talking about how their grandparents grew it. This is how memory works in families like mine. We pass things down. The stories stay alive because they mattered, because knowing what grew and what didn't, what saved you and what failed you, that was the difference between living and dying. English garden books from the 1600s give instructions for growing it. Plant in spring, harvest after frost, leave some in the ground and they'll multiply. Simple as that. No complicated techniques, no secret knowledge. Just put them in dirt and get out of the way. John Goodyear wrote in 1621 that they were a meat more fit for swine than men. That line gets quoted a lot by people who want to explain why it vanished, but that's one rich Englishman's opinion. The actual evidence, the planting records and market logs and survival accounts, they tell a different story. They tell the story of a plant that fed people through the Little Ice Age, through crop failures and wars and famines, through the brutal winters that killed half the colonies, not because it was a last resort, because it was there, reliable when everything else wasn't. My grandpa told me about the Depression years, how his mother kept the family alive when there wasn't money for store food. She had a patch of sun roots behind the house that her mother had planted, and those tubers came up every fall like clockwork. He said they ate them roasted, boiled, fried in the little bit of lard they had. He said he got tired of them, sure, but he never went hungry. That was here in America in the 1930s, but the real war stories come from Europe. World War II, when the armies took everything and the supply lines collapsed and cities starved. In Germany between 1944 and 1947, the Jerusalem artichoke became official survival food. The government actually promoted it. They published recipes. They told people to plant it in bomb craters and empty lots. There are photographs from Berlin showing women harvesting them from parks where the grass used to be. A German woman named Margaret Schütte-Lihotzky wrote about it in her diary. She was an architect imprisoned by the Nazis, and when she got out in 1945, she survived that first winter on sun roots dug from abandoned gardens. She wrote that they tasted like hope. That's the actual phrase. They tasted like hope because they were still there when everything else was gone. The Russians have similar stories. During the siege of Leningrad, 872 days of starvation, people ate anything that grew. The Jerusalem artichoke patches that had been planted before the war, they saved lives. There are Soviet agricultural reports from 1942 recommending emergency planting of them because they could survive the cold and produce food when wheat and potatoes failed. I talked to an old woman at a farmer's market 5 years ago. She was selling sunchokes from her garden. She told me her mother was a little girl in the Netherlands during the hunger winter of 1944. The Nazis had blocked food shipments. People were eating tulip bulbs. Her mother's family survived because her grandfather had a patch of Jerusalem artichokes that the soldiers didn't recognize. They took the potatoes. They took the grain. They walked right past the tall, dead sunflower stalks and never knew there was food underneath. That's 22,000 people who starved to death in the Netherlands that winter. Her family wasn't among them because of a plant that didn't look like food to the occupiers. My grandpa's stories weren't that dramatic. Nobody was shooting at him, but he said there were days when that sunroot patch was the only thing between his family and real hunger. His father couldn't find work. The neighbors were all in the same situation, but the plants didn't care about the economy. They grew anyway. He said his mother used to cry while she cooked them, not because she was sad, because she was grateful, because it's a particular kind of relief when you can feed your children and you didn't think you'd be able to. After the war, after the Depression, people wanted to forget those times. They wanted modern food from stores. They wanted to put the hunger years behind them. I understand that, but we threw out the knowledge with the memories. We decided that anything associated with poverty and war must be inferior. We looked at the plants that saved us and called them peasant food, depression food. We got embarrassed by our own survival. That's how you lose something valuable. You don't lose it because it fails. You lose it because it reminds you of when you needed it. Now let me tell you why that one plant can actually feed 8 people. This isn't folklore. This is mathematics and biology, and the numbers are staggering when you lay them out. One Jerusalem artichoke tuber planted in spring becomes a plant 6 to 10 feet tall by summer. Underground, that single tuber produces 10 to 20 new tubers by fall. Each of those tubers weighs anywhere from 2 ounces to over a pound, depending on soil and weather. Average harvest from one plant is 15 pounds. Some people get 25 pounds if conditions are right. My great-grandpa used to say you could see them multiplying if you watched close enough. He'd plant a small patch, maybe 10 tubers, and by the 3rd year he'd have enough to fill a root cellar and still leave plenty in the ground for next season. Here's the math. 15 pounds per plant. A person needs about 2,000 calories a day to live on. Jerusalem artichokes have roughly 73 calories per 100 grams. That's about 200 calories per pound, give or take. So 15 pounds gives you 3,000 calories. That's a day and a half of food from one plant. But that's not how it works in practice, because you're not eating only sunchokes. You're using them as a staple, a base. They're the thing that fills you up so the rest of your food goes further. In that role, half a pound per person per day is realistic. That's what historical accounts suggest people actually ate. Half a pound per person per day, 15 pounds per plant. That's 30 days of staple food for one person. Now plant 10 tubers. By year 2, you've got 100 plants if you managed it right. That's 1,500 pounds of food. That's 8 people fed for 90 days, 3 months. 1 initial planting, 2nd year harvest. The secret is inulin. That's the carbohydrate they store instead of starch. It's a chain of fructose molecules that humans can't digest quickly. It passes through to your gut bacteria, which break it down slowly. That means it doesn't spike your blood sugar like potatoes or wheat. It keeps you full longer. It's why diabetics in Europe used to eat them before insulin was invented. Inulin is also why they make you gassy if you eat too much too fast. My grandpa laughed about that. He said his mother would introduce them slowly each fall, let people's stomachs adjust. By midwinter, everyone could eat them without trouble, but the first week was rough. The other secret is that they're perennial. You don't replant. You don't till every spring. You don't buy seed. The tubers you don't harvest become next year's crop. They spread themselves. In good soil, they'll double their patch size every year if you let them. Compare that to corn. Corn needs replanting every year, needs fertilizer, needs perfect timing, gives you one harvest and then you start over. Modern corn yields are higher per acre, sure, but only if you've got machinery and chemicals and purchase seed. Only if you're farming at scale, for a family, for someone trying to grow food in a backyard or a small plot. Jerusalem artichokes produce more calories per square foot with less work than almost anything else you can plant. There are modern studies backing this up. A 2011 study in Poland measured yields of up to 30 tons per hectare. That's over 26,000 pounds per acre. Potatoes average around 20,000 pounds per acre, and they require way more maintenance. The plant is showing us something. It's showing us that abundance doesn't have to be complicated, that feeding people can be simple if we let it be. Between 1945 and 1965, the Jerusalem artichoke went from survival staple to agricultural ghost. 20 years, One generation. My grandpa watched it happen in real time. He said after the war ended, everything changed fast. The government men came around talking about modern farming, hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers, tractors you could buy on credit. They had pamphlets and speeches about feeding the world with science. The message was clear. If you wanted to be a real farmer, a modern farmer, you grew commodity crops, corn, wheat, soybeans, things you could sell into the big system, things that came with support programs and price guarantees and loans from the agricultural banks. Perennials didn't fit that model. You can't sell someone new perennial tubers every spring. You can't make them dependent on your fertilizer blend. You can't patent a plant that reproduces itself for free in the ground. My grandpa said his father stopped growing the sun roots around 1958, not because they failed, because the agriculture extension agent told him they were old-fashioned, because the neighbors were all switching to modern methods and he felt left behind, because the culture was changing and subsistence crops felt like poverty. This happened everywhere. The USDA pushed to annual crops that required inputs. Inputs meant sales. Sales meant economic growth. Growth meant progress. That was the logic. If you weren't buying seed and fertilizer and pesticides every year, you weren't participating in the economy properly. There's a 1962 Agriculture Department memo, declassified now, discussing problematic perennial crops in home gardens. It doesn't say they're bad plants. It says they're bad for agricultural business development. It recommends shifting extension service advice toward annual vegetable gardens that require purchased seeds. That's not conspiracy theory, that's policy. Written policy about steering people away from self-sufficient food plants. The seed companies were consolidating. In 1950, there were thousands of small seed companies in America. By 1970, a handful of corporations controlled most of the market. Those corporations didn't make money from plants that reseeded themselves or spread from roots. They made money from hybrids that didn't breed true, from varieties that needed specific conditions, from systems that required repeated purchases. Jerusalem artichokes were the opposite of that business model. They were the enemy of that business model. Plant them once, feed your family for decades, never buy them again. That's not a product, that's a solution. And solutions don't generate revenue. My grandpa said the final blow was cultural. After people survived the Depression and the war on these foods they wanted to forget. Eating sun roots reminded them of hard times. Store-bought food meant you'd made it. Processed food meant you were modern. TV dinners and canned vegetables meant you were American. So the plants that saved them became embarrassing. People plowed under their patches, stopped harvesting them, let them grow wild in the fence rows where nobody had to think about them. The seed catalogs dropped them. Burpee's catalog from 1955 lists Jerusalem artichokes. The 1968 catalog doesn't mention them at all. They didn't announce the removal. They just quietly erased them from the options. By 1970, you couldn't find them in most garden stores. By 1980, people under 30 had mostly never heard of them. By 1990, they were a curiosity that old-timers mentioned sometimes. It wasn't failure, it was economics. It wasn't nature, it was business. They vanished because they succeeded without creating dependency, because they fed people without generating profit for the supply chain. That's the pattern. Watch for it. Any food that makes people self-sufficient eventually gets marginalized, not because it doesn't work, because it works without asking permission. There's another reason they buried it, one nobody talks about, the fructose war. My grandpa didn't understand this part. He just knew the sun roots disappeared from stores. But I dug into it later, and what I found made the whole picture clear. This wasn't just about seeds and farming methods. This was about sugar and money and an industry worth billions. In the 1970s, scientists figured out how to extract inulin from Jerusalem artichokes on an industrial scale. Inulin breaks down into fructose, pure fructose, without the glucose attached. That matters because fructose is sweeter than regular sugar. You need less of it, and it doesn't spike blood sugar the same way. There were pilot programs, small factories in Europe processing sunchokes into fructose syrup, medical studies showing diabetics could tolerate it better than cane sugar, food scientists getting excited about a natural sweetener that grew like a weed and didn't need tropical plantations. Between 1975 and 1978, there were 3 major research initiatives in Germany and France looking at Jerusalem artichoke inulin as a commercial sweetener source. The yields were promising, the processing was feasible, the crop required minimal inputs, it looked like it might actually work. Then high-fructose corn syrup hit the market at scale. The corn industry had been working on enzymatic processing for years. By 1978, they'd perfected the method, take cornstarch, hit it with enzymes, convert it to fructose syrup. It was cheap, incredibly cheap, cheaper than cane sugar, cheaper than beet sugar, and definitely cheaper than processing Jerusalem artichokes. But here's the thing. Corn syrup production required massive industrial infrastructure, required corn monoculture, required the entire agricultural supply chain that companies like Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland controlled. It fit perfectly into the existing system. Jerusalem artichoke inulin didn't. Any farmer could grow the crop. Processing could be done at smaller scales. It threatened to decentralize sweetener production just when the industry was consolidating control. My father remembers the 80s, when suddenly everything had high-fructose corn syrup in it, soda, bread, ketchup, everything. The government subsidized corn production, made it artificially cheap. Corn syrup became the default sweetener for American processed food. Meanwhile, research funding for Jerusalem artichoke inulin dried up. The German program shut down by 1982. The French initiatives ended by 1985, not because the science failed, because nobody wanted to compete with subsidized corn. There's a 1984 paper from a French agricultural researcher named Marcel Renard. He'd spent 6 years studying Jerusalem artichoke cultivation for inulin production. His conclusion was that it was agronomically superior to corn for fructose production, better for soil, required less water, produced comparable yields of inulin to corn starch. But his final paragraph is devastating. He wrote that despite the agricultural advantages, economic factors made commercial development unlikely. He meant subsidies, he meant the political power of the corn lobby, he meant that the system was rigged. The diabetic community lost something real when that happened. Before insulin was common, before modern diabetes drugs, European doctors prescribed Jerusalem artichokes. The inulin fed gut bacteria that helped regulate blood sugar. It wasn't a cure, but it helped. My aunt has diabetes. She found out about sunchokes 5 years ago and started eating them. Her A1C numbers improved, not dramatically but measurably. She asked her doctor about them. He'd never heard of them. 40 years of medical training, and he'd never heard of a traditional diabetic food that grew in every temperate climate. That's what erasure looks like. Not just removing something from stores, removing it from medical knowledge, from cultural memory, making it so thoroughly forgotten that doctors don't know what their great-grandparents prescribed. But something's happening now, something the system didn't plan for. The plant is coming back, and it's coming back without permission. I started noticing it about 10 years ago. Farmers' markets, there'd be one vendor, usually an older person or someone into permaculture, with a basket of these knobby tubers. They'd have a handwritten sign, sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes. Most people walked right past. But some people stopped, some people remembered. My cousin started growing them in 2015. She's got a small farm in Oregon, grows vegetables for restaurants. She told me a chef asked her if she could source sunchokes. He'd eaten them in France, wanted to put them on his menu. She planted a 20-foot row. By year 3, she had more than she could sell. Now she's got waiting lists. Restaurants want them. People doing keto diets want them because of the inulin. Diabetics are finding out about them through internet forums. The demand is small, but it's real, and it's growing. There's a permaculture network that tracks perennial vegetables. They list Jerusalem artichokes as one of the top 10 forgotten crops making a comeback. Not because of government programs, not because some corporation decided to market them, because people are sharing tubers, planting them, talking about them. I've seen it in my own community. An old-timer brought some to a seed swap 3 years ago. Free tubers, just take some and grow them. By the next year, 5 people had patches going. By this year, they're at the farmer's market. The plant is spreading itself again the way it used to, through networks of people who recognize value when they see it. The science community is paying attention too. There's a research team at the University of Wisconsin studying Jerusalem artichoke cultivars. They're looking at which varieties produce the most inulin, which ones taste best, which ones store longest, and they published a paper in 2019 about its potential as a climate-resilient crop. Climate resilient, that's the new language. It means crops that can handle weird weather, temperature swings, drought stress. Jerusalem artichokes check every box. They're basically indestructible once established. There's a seed company in Maine, Fedco Seeds, that's been selling Jerusalem artichoke tubers for 20 years. They sell out every year. They've got multiple varieties now. They're treating it like a serious crop, not a curiosity. I talked to their buyer last year. He said demand has tripled since 2015. Mostly from young farmers doing small-scale sustainable agriculture, people who want perennial systems, people who are tired of fighting the soil every spring. In Europe, it never completely disappeared. France kept growing them. You can find them in Paris markets in the fall. There are traditional recipes that never died out. Now French chefs are making them trendy again, and that's spreading back to America. There's a restaurant in Brooklyn that serves them roasted with herbs, charges $18 for a side dish. My grandpa would laugh at that, but it means something. It means they're back in the culture, even if it's through expensive restaurants at first. The homesteading movement is bringing them back too. People wanting food security, wanting to grow calories, not just salad greens. They're discovering what my great-grandparents knew. Plant these once, eat forever. I've got my own patch now. Started it 4 years ago with tubers from that farmer's market vendor. It's about 40 feet long now. I harvest a couple 100 pounds every fall. Give most of it away. People try them. Some people love them. Some people don't. But they remember them. That's what matters. The knowledge is coming back, slowly, through farmers' markets and seed swaps and internet forums and old people who remember. The system didn't want this plant. But the plant doesn't care what the system wants. Here's what you need to understand. This isn't just about one plant. This is about a pattern that repeats over and over, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every food that feeds people without creating dependency gets marginalized, not always violently, not always obviously, but systematically, quietly, through economic pressure and cultural shame and the slow erasure of knowledge. Jerusalem artichokes are just one example. There are dozens more. Perennial grains that were abandoned for annual wheat, amaranth that fed the Aztecs until the Spanish banned it, ground nuts that Native Americans cultivated for protein, tree crops that produced for decades but got replaced by annual vegetables. The pattern is always the same. These foods work too well. They make people too independent. They don't require enough inputs. They can't be controlled through patents and supply chains, so they get pushed out. Not because they fail, because they succeed without chains. My grandpa didn't have the language for this, he just knew something was wrong. He'd say, we used to know how to feed ourselves and then we forgot. But it wasn't forgetting. It was systematic replacement of knowledge that created independence with knowledge that created dependence. The industrial food system needs you to need it, needs you to buy seeds every year, needs you to buy fertilizer and pesticides, needs you to believe that food comes from stores and experts and corporations. Any plant that contradicts that story becomes a problem. Jerusalem artichokes contradict that story completely. They say food can be easy. They say abundance doesn't require complexity. They say you can plant something once and feed your family for generations. That's a dangerous message if you're trying to sell people things they don't actually need. But the plant survived anyway, in ditches and fence rows, and the gardens of people who refused to forget, in Europe where the memory stayed stronger, in the knowledge of old people who lived through times when this stuff mattered, and now it's coming back because the system is showing cracks, because people are realizing that depending entirely on supply chains is fragile, because climate chaos is making people think about resilient food, because the cost of industrial food keeps rising while these perennials just keep growing. The knowledge waits. That's what my great-grandpa used to say about the old ways. The knowledge waits for when people are ready to remember it. It doesn't die completely. It goes underground like those tubers and waits for conditions to be right. We're living in the time when conditions are getting right again, when people are ready to ask hard questions about why we eat what we eat and who benefits from those choices. When the official story about progress and efficiency is starting to sound hollow. Jerusalem artichokes are coming back because people are planting them, not because some authority gave permission, not because they're suddenly profitable for corporations, because individuals decided this knowledge was worth keeping alive. That's how you fight erasure. Not with arguments, not with protests. You fight it by doing the thing they said wasn't worth doing, by growing the plant they said wasn't worth growing, by keeping the knowledge alive in your hands and your garden and your community. I've got tubers I can share if you're near me. If you're not, find someone who's growing them. They're out there. Or buy some from one of the seed companies that still sells them. Plant them. Watch them grow. Feed yourself from them. Then give tubers to someone else. That's how this plant survives. That's how the knowledge survives. Person to person, garden to garden, generation to generation. The system can't stop that. They can ignore it. They can marginalize it. But they can't stop people from sharing something that grows. The root that feeds 8 people per plant is still here, still waiting, still offering the same abundance it always has. All we have to do is remember it exists and put it in the ground. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more plants like this, more foods that were erased, more knowledge that's waiting. We're going to find it and bring it back, one story at a time.